our live stream. My name is Brad Haywood. I'm the Executive Director of Justice Forward Virginia, and joined this evening by Buda Bibrai, Commonwealth Attorney for Loudoun County. Say hi, Buda.
Good evening. Hello.
And Brian Kennedy. Brian Kennedy's on the board of Justice Forward. Brian's also a senior public defender in Fairfax County, and I run the Arlington County Public Defender's Office. So we are, tonight we're gathered online. We're all coming to you live from our homes, because where else would we be? To talk about two different things. To talk about, first of all, about COVID-19 and its effects in the criminal justice system. And then after we do that for about 45 minutes, we're going to move on to discuss the last legislative session, which wrapped up right as all of this was starting to take place. So that the legislature was in session until right at the beginning of March, and then we've sort of had the shutdown since then. So just diving right in, I wanted to kind of just first of all take the temperature from you guys, and then we'll just be talking about this. But Brian, how about I ask you first? What's you worked in indigent defense for how long now?
Over 8 years now.
Have you ever experienced anything like this in your job?
Not only I don't think we've never experienced something like this, but we've never even had to think about experiencing something like this. And it's just like everything else we're doing, completely unprecedented in every aspect of our job.
What about you, Buda?
Clearly, equally just what Brian said, we've never either. I think the only thing this makes me sometimes reflect is on that Friday when we had 9/11, where we were all caught in between courts and trying to figure out what was going on, just the surrealness. But as far as something with this longevity, no, never in my life.
Yeah, no, exactly what you mean. I've been taking long walks at night around Arlington, and it feels, every night I walk around, there's nobody out. I remember actually was in Manhattan on 9/11, and it feels like the night of 9/11, but every single night is mind-blowing. Of course, everybody is going through this right now. That's nothing anybody's learning from us right now. But I think what everybody hears about, and they probably don't know a lot about, is people hear, they see an article in Slate or The Atlantic or whatever news outlet they read with a headline talking about COVID-19 and the jails or prisons. But it's not something that everybody really has a firsthand perspective on. And I think it's just given given the seriousness of the risks that people are facing in jails, and quite frankly also just in the criminal justice system more broadly, including on the law enforcement side, this is information that we want, I think, more people to understand, because I think we can all agree, although people are starting to catch on, not everyone is taking it as seriously as they ought to. And just to kind of, to give people a bit of a preview or an overview of why we care about this, or why we are so alarmed. I've looked at this since the crisis began, looked at jails and prisons as sort of like the land-bound, less sanitary version of a cruise ship. And I think that's an easy way for people to relate to this, because we all know that I think it was about 25 different cruises that were responsible for the incubation and amplification of the virus at a massive level, way disproportionate to the numbers of people that were on those. And what we've been told just from the beginning, and I think we all understand this when you think about it, is the structural features of a jail are almost identical to a cruise ship. Obviously, the people inside are having a lot less fun, but in terms of how it's set up, you have people who share everything, shared everything down to the soap they share, the showers they share, the ventilation that goes into their cells, the rec spaces. They can't leave. There's a general lack of medical treatment, and there's a pretty much of an inability for jails to keep it from spreading, just because of the things they have to do. People have to come out of their cells at points. They have to be transported to places. They have to be in cells a lot of times with other inmates. And then, of course, the last part of this that people maybe don't realize is that anybody who's in a local jail, like we deal with on a daily basis, they're getting out, and they're usually getting out pretty soon. So you have this phenomenon known as jail churn, where it's somebody gets arrested, they go in, they spend a few weeks in the jail, and then they come out. And if you've got somewhere that is just incubating the disease, and someone's going into that place and then coming out 3 weeks later or a month later, I think we can all see, obviously, what's going to happen there and why this situation can become more worrisome. I know we want to talk more about what's going on in individual jurisdictions, but what are your guys' thoughts on that? Just the general issue of COVID-19 in jails and prisons.
If I could just step into that a little bit to just share anecdotally and perspective, is you identified the cruise ships. What we've been looking at, especially in Loudoun County, because we've had an outbreak in our retirement communities, in our nursing homes. That's another, what we call a closed community, that you're looking at, that they can't avoid it. So if you can't avoid it in a nursing community where the rooms are independent, that I individualize that, maybe in my own room, you in your own, and it's still crossing over and infecting large numbers, then you're, as you indicated earlier, that ability to be able to do that in a jails, I don't think it's existent. It's just a matter of time, just waiting for it to happen. And then it's just going to be a matter of like, oh, how do we deal with it? And by then it's I think we have too many trapped bodies to be able to do justice to the people inside, as well as the jailers, the individuals who work, and the civilians who work at the jails. Because they're the ones who, you're talking about the jail churn, but here you have a civilian or an officer churn. They're in and out, in and out, in and out. So you don't know if they're going to pick it up from inside the jail and bring it home, or they're going to bring it from the outside community and bring it inside. But that's the risk that it really presents across the board, and why our community needs to be very concerned about that.
Yeah, that point you made about the staff at the jail, I don't know how it is out in Loudoun. Housing further out west gets a little more affordable, but in Arlington, the deputies don't live in Arlington for the most part. Some of them do, but actually we, as in my office, with the Arlington Public Defender, we actually got a list of the zip codes, no other information about where they live, just the zip codes. You get a sense for how, if they catch it at work, or if they get it, these guys come in at weird hours, they know that, and often work on weekends. So, they very frequently live very, very far distances. And, that's another, I think, factor that people aren't really thinking about. And one other thing along with that, I love the nursing home analogy, because that's another thing I didn't mention, is that jail populations tend to be more susceptible because of the medical conditions they have. The Prison Policy Institute, I read an article by them. For example, there's a whole list of conditions that render people more susceptible to both to getting the virus and also just to experiencing the most severe side effects. Tuberculosis is 5 times more common in jails than it is in the population at large. Asthma is twice as common. HIV infection is more than 3 times as common among the jail population, and on and on. Just go down the whole list of conditions. And a lot of our clients, or people involved, court involved, have those conditions. So, what do you think, Brian? I'm kind of hogging the microphone.
I think, kind of jumping off that point, something else that's evident that it seems clear from the literature on this right now is that it's affecting the African American community in a much more intense way. And at least in Fairfax, the last data I have, which is probably about a year ago before the most recent drop, our jail is 40% Black and our county is only 10% Black. So there's a real racial dynamic here, in addition to the socioeconomic issues, in addition to the health poverty issues that are going to be there. And then, probably going off what you said, Buddha, it's a nursing home, it's a cruise ship, but it's a nursing home or a cruise ship where everyone does not want to be there and is forced to be there.
An outbreak of 7% that test of the incarcerated tested positive, and out in the general population, what are we looking at? A little under 1%. Yep. As being the norm. So if that does not indicate to you the potential for harm and the devastation that can cause, because that number is just going to increase, and we can't look at it as just being the fact that, well, we'll treat them, or New York's talking about having all sorts of medical issues as far as not having enough beds, not having enough equipment. They're sure as heck not going to redirect them into the jails and prisons. So what are you going to do? You're just going to kind of leave them there and hope they survive. And if they don't, oh, well. And that's the sad travesty of that. It's because that also has to negatively impact the people that work there as far as the trauma that they're going to be subjected to. So you just look at that more than just the incarcerated, but those that come into contact with them, their families, their communities, that's the part that we just have to add that different lens to it to talk about. It's not just the person who's accused or convicted of having done something wrong, but let's talk about our communities as a whole.
Yeah, you brought up New York's Rikers. I saw a graph or chart that was, I think it was a Chicago Tribune, some Chicago-based news outlet. And it was actually inaccurate, but it was the top 5. If you're looking at just jails or ships as localities, like the top 5 places in the world in terms of infection rate, and 3 of them were jails or prisons. And then another one was the aircraft carrier. But and I think the last one might have been actually a nursing home. But I mean, we get the idea, you know.
Right.
And it is. I think the last figure was 7.8% of Rikers is, and now it's not just happening in big cities. You see in DC yesterday, or it might have been, no, it was yesterday. An article Bradley Balco in the Post wrote about it, and he interviewed a DC public defender, just talking about the conditions there. And I think they're up about 50 now, infections in their jail, which is terrible. But for sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, we just had a deputy test positive in our booth. And the only thing I could come back with is like, well, I appreciate that it's one and he tested positive, and now obviously he's at home making sure that he's fine. But I don't know if that gives a whole lot of comfort to the people who were in that booth with him, because there's a control booth. If I'm one of those 6 or 7 individuals working with him, I'm freaking out as to what this means. And then it's also, if I didn't know he had it, have I now also worked myself into the jail and come in contact with somebody else who then actually becomes a person who comes directly in contact with the civilians within the jail or the incarcerated? And then are we bringing it back outside? And that's the harm that COVID is really presenting to us, that it's not something that we see. And you could be asymptomatic, and you're coming in here and you're infesting us all. So those are things that why it's so important for us to do what we can as a system to say somebody who doesn't need to be in a jail or in some locked facility out of a safety concern, out of violence, then now's a good time for us to have just a different lens towards that. Because it's not just a matter of being, oh, we're going to be light on crime, or now we're going to not exact the full punishment from that person, but it's just saying, let's look at the greater picture. What are we doing to the community if we don't and take action now, and then we let this virus just exponentially spread? Is that really what we want to have at the end of the day? But at least we got another 30 days from that person and we didn't let him out early. That's not a conversation I want to have with anybody when somebody's been deathly ill or dead.
Right.
And we have to look at that as a community to figure out, what are we really doing as the greater good for our community? What are we really doing for protection?
Well, I think whoever at least probably a handful of the dozen people that are watching this are probably from Loudoun or Northern Virginia, probably curious about what you're doing in Loudoun, in the on the law enforcement side, to address the law enforcement and courts to address this. I guess that wouldn't mind talking about that a bit, just from the level of arrest to bond, to release from jail. How have things been going in Loudoun? What's sort of the status of that out where you are?
What we did from the very beginning, because that was the change that the community wanted, in cases that are low-level nonviolent offenses, we're not defaulting to jail. Literally, we have to articulate why we want to put somebody in jail if they're being convicted of an offense such as that, rather than dealing with other avenues or tools in our toolkit. So what that fortunately allowed for our community is, on average, we had about 400 and change coming in at the jail on a regular basis. And by the fact as to how we changed how we approach cases, that number was slowly being reduced, so that by the time that we had to deal with the COVID matter about the month of March, we were down to about 360. The jail then took a lot of, to their credit, just the initiative that they undertook by getting in contact with us and saying, we have a work release center. There's only 11 or 12 people in it, but help us get them out, because we need to transition them to home electronic monitoring. So these are individuals who are already in the community, were coming back to the jail to sleep, but they were out in the community, they were working, and they wanted to close down that facility for a number of things. One, we had conversations to make sure in the event we need that space for COVID-related seclusions, you need to have that. That facility also was an added risk because, as we indicated, that not only are the jailers who are supervising these individuals coming in and out, but the individuals themselves are coming in and out. So you are now subjecting either the community, or the community is going to be subjecting those within the work release center to a heightened risk. So we worked with them. We had some concerns originally from our courts as to whether or not they wanted to be able to be part of that process, because they didn't feel that that was compliant with what the justice from the Supreme Court was saying, the types of the cases that we should be handling, because it didn't fall necessarily under a bond per se. And that was very kind of a strict reading as to what the justice was authorizing them to do. But we worked around that. So we were able to pretty much have everybody transition to the home electronic monitoring. And then we were dealing with those individuals who had less than 6 months left in their sentence. And we were processing them through the assistance and the vetting of the jail, working with the defense counsel, presenting consent orders to the courts. And there were some that they were signing, there were others that they weren't. Then I had a conversation with the jail that there is a code section that actually says, you as the sheriff have the authority, if you give notice to the prosecution, to the Commonwealth, that you can convert somebody from serving time in jail to home electronic monitoring. Initially, they were not wanting to do that, and I don't know if it's plausible deniability or whatever, and I'm not getting to why the decision-making was that. And then our chief judge made a comment on a couple of the orders saying, you have the authority to do this without court intervention, and then entered some of those orders and then ultimately converted to, I'm not answering this because you already have the authority. You don't need me to do this.
How overall, how have you felt like your judges have been receptive to this, like the concerns?
I
don't mean to put you
I'm not throwing them under the bus, and I'm not trying to be judgmental. I think everybody's just kind of concerned because with the way that the elections were last year. It's almost like there's a whole lot of steam behind it. Oh my goodness, any of these innovative prosecutors, what they're going to do is they're going to come in here, and all of a sudden there's going to be turmoil and chaos. And I think they're cautious in that regards to what are we doing versus just slow down and actually listen to us. We're not doing anything that hasn't been done historically for hundreds of years. We're just now more transparent. So when we're doing something, we're telling you why we're doing it. It's not in the old days where we just did it, nobody asked any questions, and we moved on. So it's a growing process for us, and we're hoping that they will be able to give us the benefit of the doubt to understand and ask the questions. We'll articulate why we're doing everything. If we can't articulate it, we shouldn't be doing it. So that part has been a transition, which I was kind of surprised of the limitation as to them wanting to go forward, because as I said, we're not doing anything that hasn't been done by every prior administration, but I think we're getting a lot more scrutiny. But we'll work through it.
Do you know how many people, just talking about the people who are serving sentences where someone made a request for them to be released early, do you know about how many people have been released in that situation?
Let me answer it this way. We had 49 on that list. Our office vetted, and there's about 18 that we would not endorse being released because they're there for violent offenses. And then so that left us approximately 23, 24. And we have reduced that by half. So that's just a matter of a process of trying to figure out how we can best make sure they also have places to be released to. Do they have any placements within the community? Because even housing is a problem if somebody doesn't have housing. So we're just trying to make sure that the decision we're making, one, it's a safety consideration for the community, and two, that we're actually not further endangering this person by saying, yes, get out of the jail, but now where are you going?
Yeah.
So we're trying to be mindful of that. And our pretrial and community corrections program and our adult probation have been very supportive of that. And that's been really one of the blessings that we've had, is that collaboration.
Do you know what your jail count is, like as of today or past couple of days?
I could do it for the last couple of days because we are at 263.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
So that number has been incrementally, as I said, kind of working down. And that's also part of it is because people have served their sentence and are being released, and we're not replenishing them. Yeah. To answer your question, Brad, as you said earlier, is kind of what are we doing for the enforcement? Our sheriff's office has been very mindful that if somebody is violating the crime and it's a misdemeanor, using the resources of a summons versus an arrest warrant. Those who are being arrested, our magistrates are also being thoughtful about the fact as to, do we need to have them incarcerated pre-trial, or can we put them on some sort of pre-trial services? Can we put them on some electronic monitoring? What other tools do we have in our kit rather than, again, defaulting like in the days of old to just lock you up and we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
So I think everybody, to a certain degree, has been taking the COVID situation very seriously.
I was struck by that too in Arlington, and it was less true out in Loudoun, but in Arlington County, Carissa Degani Tafty ran as a reformer, and during the campaign, there came to be some tension between her and the police department, and it weren't off on the best of terms when she started her tenure. But I was really struck because the Arlington Police Department were some of the first to say, you know what, we're doing something about this. And I think for the most part, we're seeing that. We don't see a lot of the petty arrests anymore, and they are trying to write more tickets, summonses, instead of arresting people, bringing them to the jail. So I found that to be encouraging, just to see that even where we're not necessarily on the same page on other stuff, people in the criminal justice community are, trying to work together in the interest of the community. Brian, what about what's going on in Fairfax?
In Fairfax, I think the response from a lot of us, we found it was a little too slow from the Commonwealth's attorney at first. But since then, things have definitely improved and gotten to at least close to where we need to be. The arrests are way down. That's based on cases coming into the public defender's office. People who are being held are way down, both on felonies and misdemeanors. Our court services unit, who is doing the pretrial investigations, and the Commonwealth's attorney now meet every morning to look at the people who are being arraigned that morning and see if the Commonwealth will agree. And they have been agreeing to release people, including on felonies, and they get out then right at arraignment, so they don't have to wait for another day for a bond motion in solitary confinement, which is really a first step to what I see as a counsel at first appearance that we'll talk about in our second portion of this potentially.
Just to break that down, just not assuming everybody is an expert on this, but your first hearing after you're arrested, if you don't have a bond you can pay, or if you're released without a bond, it's called an arraignment or an advisement. And so a big deal in Virginia criminal procedure is trying to get it so that lawyers can appear with a client at that first appearance. So the fact that it's happening now, or that there's some intervention from even just from a Commonwealth's attorney, I think is great.
Yeah, and it's definitely a change in procedure that was not happening before this, and definitely not before January 1st. The jail population is down. As of Monday, it was down to 520. On March 1st, it was at 736.
Wow.
And 2 years ago, our average daily population was over 1,000.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it's been a lot of work over the past few years to reduce it, but then it's even been reduced by quite a bit by the Commonwealth agreeing to bail in many cases. And the Commonwealth, they're now, as of Monday, it was 73 people who were held in the jail serving sentences who they have agreed to release. And the judges have been pretty good about granting those. It was a little slow at the beginning, but especially over the past few weeks, and especially when the Commonwealth agrees, judges have been generally granting those orders and granting them fairly quickly once they receive them.
Well, for Arlington, I think right before the crisis began, we were at, I think, around 275, the jail count, which was close to an all-time low, just in general. And I think we're now at, as of this week, we're at 226 or thereabouts. So we're not doing quite as well as you guys. I think about 20% reduction. Our issue has not been the Commonwealth's attorney or really the police. We have not every judge in our courthouse sees this issue the way that we do. So we, in my office, speaking of public defender, is that I think we've had now 4 different bond motions where we've asked the circuit court, and we've had the agreement of the Commonwealth where they've agreed, like, this person should get out on some conditions, and the court has nonetheless denied the motion, which is very frustrating. And then we also, we haven't had more than, I mean, you can count the number of early releases on one hand, maybe even like 3 fingers, maybe 1 finger. I can't even think of more than 1 or 2. I think I can think of 2. It might be more than that, but not a lot. And we'll even go. I can think of a couple that I'm handling. I don't even handle as many cases as a lot of my attorneys. But I can think of a couple of mine where we've asked for reconsideration. We filed the motions, and the judges haven't even docketed them for a hearing.
Right.
Won't even say yes or no. Won't even let us talk about it with them. So that's been pretty frustrating. I think it's a lot of this. It's quite frankly, I worry that it's ignorance. I worry that it's this mindset that, oh well, we don't have it in our jail yet. We don't have to worry about it because it's not there. And I would say this, in addition to having a police department that seems to be doing a good job with this stuff, we're lucky to have a really good sheriff. Sheriff Arthur's very thoughtful. She's got a really awesome chief deputy who's been fantastic also. And they've gotten their house in order. They've got a really good procedure for new jail admissions. They've been actively, I don't want to speak for them. They seem to be very interested in getting people out of their jail because they see it. They see what their colleagues are dealing with in DC or in New York. They don't want to have a bunch of people who are entrusted, to their custody dying on their watch, and they're human beings. They know the people who are in their jail are human beings too. They don't want them to die. And I think they see the risks. I don't know that everybody in our courthouse does. Thankfully, Parissa's office has been quite good on this. It's been easy to work with her on this. But overall, I think we still have work to do. And I just, every day, I'm just fingers crossed that we don't have a case. And so far we don't. There've been rumors that people have high temperatures and stuff, but I haven't heard of anything. And actually, that's a funny thing. It's that's not really funny because jails aren't funny. But you talk to some of my clients who are in the jail, and for them, life hasn't changed that much. At least in the Arlington jail, they haven't added a ton of restrictions to people who've been there for a while. If you've been there for a long time and you haven't had contact with somebody who's been exposed, and there's no way for you to, then you don't necessarily have to take all the same precautions. So a lot of them are getting this kind of rec that they used to, and being able to get out of their cells and pick up the phone or shoot baskets or whatever it is they want to do. I thought that was interesting, but still, obviously, there's still a huge risk. As much as they want to do to prevent the virus from getting in the jail, as much as they would like to do to keep it from spreading, like we were talking about earlier, there's certain things they simply cannot stop doing, which are people coming to work and people doing their jobs, which involve things like putting handcuffs on inmates, shackling them when they're transporting them, being in elevators with them if they're taking them from floor to floor, things like that. So there's always going to be a level of risk involved, and we just really hope to God that it doesn't come to fruition. But that's actually a question that was asked. So this is a two-part question, I guess. How do you respond to a judge, or in Brian's case, a prosecutor who makes that argument that it's not in the jail yet, so we don't have to worry about it. And then as a second part to that, is there any way we can make the jail or the sheriffs or the court do more, such as implement more testing procedures for people who are in the jails? Because it's quite possible the reason nobody has it is because we don't know that they have it. But they actually do have it, and they just haven't been tested like so much of the community. So whichever you wants to answer that.
You want to go ahead, Brian?
So that's a huge problem in Richmond right now. The Commonwealth attorney there was quoted in the paper today saying that she has a major concern because there are no cases in their jail. There are cases in the community, and we're sending people away from a place we know has no cases into a place with cases, and we should keep them in the jail for these people's own safety, basically, which I think is obviously short-sighted. We had a prosecutor in Fairfax on March 18th say in a hearing I was arguing that there was a 0% chance of contracting coronavirus in the jail because of the procedures the sheriff was going to set up to avoid that from happening. We now have 4. And we know that 4 came from community spread because the people who have it have been in the jail long enough where they did not enter the jail with it. So obviously the number of actual positives is much higher than that. So I think it's it's a big issue, and I'm trying to look at Lauren's comment here because she's in Richmond, but about putting pressure on your local Commonwealth attorney politically and through the media. I think that's been a big help in places trying to get people to get on board and seeing the danger. I think every epidemiologist who's out there agrees that jails are a very dangerous place to be right now. And if you don't get ahead of it, you're going to turn into Rikers Island. Buddha, I don't know what else you have to say about that.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. But I think it really is a situation, as you indicated, where everybody's got to take it seriously from their perspective, see what they can do to contribute to decreasing those numbers. It's hard for somebody in the general community who has no contact with the criminal justice system to wrap their mind around it as to it is safe, because we don't let, we clean up the jails and we do all these things to make sure that they are safe. But if you look at those are similar procedures to the nursing homes. Talk about, especially when you've got those nursing homes where somebody is got a medical staff around them. Guess what? They clean all the time. Their individuals are isolated from one another because they're in individual bedrooms. But what happens is you have, like we had in Loudoun County with Falcons Landing, we've had deaths result in those communities. It's no different. The only difference is whether or not, as Brad was saying earlier, the people in jail don't want to be there and they have bars in their cells and they can't leave if they wanted to or they felt threatened or at risk. They can't. But we as a society have to be mindful about that and figure out what do we do to anticipate this. We don't wait, as you said in Fairfax, it's not going to happen now. Oh, shucks, there's 4. It's going to happen. It's just how we're going to deal with it to try to anticipate that when it happens, we're in the best situation to make sure that people don't die from it, that the people who work at the jail, those who are serving at the jail, that they don't end up resulting in a death, because that is, as a community, when we realize that was the biggest missed opportunity to do right by our community.
And thank you, Brian, for calling my attention to these comments. It's the first time I've ever done a Facebook Live, and I forgot that we were even getting comments, but we are. And there's a really good question here about, so we're talking all about our local jails, but of course, and we think about that all the time, understandably, because those are the people we can most directly affect, given what we do for a living. A lot of people just don't know that. As a public defender, once your client is sentenced, you might have some interaction with them in their appeals or, sometimes with the reconsideration motions. But once they're in the Department of Corrections, that's, they don't have a lawyer anymore. And so we often don't think we can help them. I happen to, before when I was in private practice, I did a lot of post-conviction work, so I know something about this. But what can we do about people who are in DOC, Department of Corrections facilities? So they're in prison serving longer sentences. I know this is a big deal right now. There's gotten some seriously bad press, and rightfully so, about the women's prison in Goochland. There's been a huge outbreak there. I think it's a huge percentage of the facility, and they've already had their first death. Of a real live human being, not just a number. This is really happening, and if there's one there now, they're going to be more given their infection rate. I would say this to that: the one thing that can be done for them is emergency legislation, and so that is being proposed, and then also clemency. So there was a I will call it ignorant because that's what I think it was, an article that was written by a state senator recently, talking about the limitations on the governor's pardon powers, it's just nonsense. There are limitations that have been imposed as a matter of custom or tradition, but if you read the Constitution of Virginia or the common law, the governor's pardon power is virtually unlimited. And in Virginia, it's only been limited in one case, really, which was the restoration of voting rights case, Howell versus McAuliffe. And that the only way it was limited there was you have to mete it out. You have to grant pardons on an individual basis. So basically, you just have to sign individual pieces of paper, or somebody has to put the governor's signature stamp on those things. But you can do it for whatever reason you want. And Governor McAuliffe proved that when he reinstated voting rights without any individual applications, without all these people going before a parole board, without a review of the detailed facts of the thing they were convicted for, just because it was the right thing to do. And Governor Northam can do exactly that with people who are in Goochland Women's Correctional Facility. And quite frankly, you should. there should be a lot more people that are being released from those places right now than's happening. And I can tell you, in my office, we're trying to do that on a local level because there are limited options. People who are not following this may not know there are places like New Jersey and Kentucky where governors or the statewide public defender system or the attorney general has made some agreement to release prisoners. In New Jersey, they did it through an order of the Supreme Court. Virginia, you can't do that. There's just no mechanism for it. It's got to come through the governor or it's got to come through emergency legislation. It seems like with emergency legislation, you have to get like 80% of the votes, which is never happening, or you have to wait until I think July 1st or later in the year for it to take effect. So really our only option is clemency when we're trying to get people out of our local jails. It's either our judges listen or prosecutors listen, or we've got to ask the governor. And so like my office right now, we're actually preparing a petition for clemency it'll probably end up being 50, 60 people. Hope to get that to him soon. And it's, giving them an opportunity. Like, look, people have done the vetting on this. These are the people who you can let out, who you should let out given the public health risks. Do it. So
And I
thank
think
you for
that's
that question.
I think that what we need to do is to, and I didn't use this insultingly to suggest anybody's ignorance, but we have to educate our community as to, because a lot of people think that those who are in jail or who are in prison are all murderers and rapists. And the majority of the people that we have who are incarcerated are property crimes. And that's the part we have to start understanding is this really an opportunity to limit what the negative impact is going to be on our community? Do we want to miss this opportunity just to say that, yeah, but you know what, they've been sentenced, now they owe us, the state or society, that amount of time? They may, and that might be your moral feeling or your ethical feeling, your view on what the law is. But at the end of the day, what do we want to do is we want safety in the community. And that includes our jails and our prisons. That's a part of our community. So we just have to have that little bit of the distancing as to making sure people understand that the majority of the individuals who are incarcerated are not violent individuals. There are a portion of them, and guess what? I'll speak for me. I'm not asking for them to be released. I understand that they have the COVID risk as well, but I'm not asking for them to be released. But we have a fair amount of individuals who would not be an unreasonable risk to our community, and those are the ones that we need to look at and see what powers we could do from a local perspective or a statewide perspective. And we have to use every means available to us to at least address it, and then make that individual vetting and make that individual decision so that we know we are taking a worthy risk on the decisions that we're making as far as releasing individuals.
Yeah, good, Dren.
I was just going to say, I want to jump in as someone who does think we should be releasing people in prison on violent crimes. Mostly because, and I would recommend everyone listening, there was an article in the Washington Post this weekend by John Pfaff. I forget what section it's in, but it's PFAF, or someone can correct me how to spell his last name.
PFAF.
PFAF. Yeah. Yes. But he has a larger book called Locked In that talks about these issues. But basically, people who have committed violent crimes are of the lowest recidivism risk. So people who have the highest recidivism risk are people who have drug offenses and people who have some property crimes like burglary. But people who commit robberies, rapes, murders are usually in so long that they either age out of violent crime or you're just very unlikely to do it again. So right now, and there's been some things in the comments, a lot of people talking online about these issues, saying we need to focus on nonviolent people, and that's true. But we sentence people for violent crime way too long. People are in jail right now who are not a risk to society, regardless of what they did 5-10 years ago. And there are plenty of people that we can statistically consider not a risk to the community now when we look past their charge and look to the rehabilitation they've done in DOC, their age, their family situation. So we shouldn't be defining people just based off their charge from however long ago.
So I was going to say that I was going to put my prosecutor hat on right now, but I actually don't have one of those hats. So I'm going to, but I will play devil's advocate for a minute, because I do understand why people feel differently about people in serving, jail or prison sentences for violent crimes. one reason is that the interest in retribution is higher. That's not something that obviously is something that resonates with me, but it does with a lot of people. You do the crime, you do the time, or this just desserts theory. There's basically an amount of punishment that you need to experience for what you did. When you let somebody out early, and of course that's closely tied, even though maybe it shouldn't be, because our processes should be more restorative, it is closely tied to victims' interests in the way that we deal with crime right now in the US. So I get why that's being thought about. To me, it's more of a political issue, and like you, Brian, I think we should get over it. But I would say, as a one other point to more advocate for their release, is that in Virginia, a lot of things that are called violent crimes aren't violent crimes. And I think the best example is robbery. Oddly, I mean, we will talk about this. And by the way, we're going to probably, I guess this is going well, so we'll go to 8 with this before we do the wrap up. Provided you can stick around, Buda, can you?
I'm in my office.
Awesome.
I'm working. We're good.
Well, so we advocated, Justice for Virginia did this year. We had a bill to create degrees of robbery. Degrees meaning not all robberies are punished the same way, because in Virginia they currently are. Whether you have a loaded firearm pointed at somebody's head, threaten to murder them and their family, and then take their $100,000 for them, or you are an 18-year-old going to high school, you push some kid up against his locker and take his used iPhone, or even something less, a $20 bill from his wallet. That's the same crime, and it's a life offense in Virginia. You guys know this. Not everybody watching knows this, but it's a life offense either way. It's ridiculous. So we have 2 of these actually right now, people for whom we've asked bond in Arlington, and they're both more like pickpocketing crimes. There was some aggression involved, but there were no weapons. In one instance, it was a guy basically bullying a guy about his same age to try to get his phone away from them. In another instance, it was 2 guys doing more or less the same thing. One guy holding the guy up, another guy taking his wallet. Not holding him up like with a gun or anything, but sort of like, lightly physically accosting him to a level that he had suffered no injuries whatsoever. But in both of their cases, neither of them have an adult criminal record. There's no reason. I can't see any reason. I mean, it's frankly, that's honestly in other contexts, like high school, it's kid stuff. Like that's something that happens. And if we're thinking about people like that as the kind of violent criminals who we can't let out, even under these circumstances, I think we just sort of have to readjust our perspective a bit. The same thing happens, as you guys know, with assault crimes. You just look at it on a piece of paper. Assault and battery in Virginia can be something as little as a push or grabbing someone's arm, and even malicious wounding often can be something fairly minor. You punch somebody, and they end up with a scratch on their face, or God forbid they break a tooth. You're going to be charged with unlawful wounding, or maybe malicious wounding. And we see that on a piece of paper, a charge list. Like, are we going to apply for clemency for this person? We're going to try to get them out on compassionate release. We say, no, they're violent. And then it takes people like, us 3 or whoever else to actually look at the facts and like, no, folks, like we just, as a justice system, we just need to readjust our sights. We need to be more compassionate and actually look beyond just the labels or whatever convenient sorting, protocol we've grown accustomed to.
I think that's the hardest part, is because, as you said it's political to a certain degree. It's also hype, because until and I'll speak from a prosecutor's perspective, until we start looking into the facts of the case rather than, as you said, what the counts or the charges, then we really are not doing justice for our community. Because then we're just running and checking a box and saying, fine, what can we do? Because if somebody looks this up, they'll know that I convicted somebody of, let's say it's a grand larceny of a car. Yep, I got it. They stole 2 cars. And I had this come across my desk this week where somebody noticed an appeal because the 20-year-old's guidelines were 1 day to 6 months, entered a plea of guilty. So he accepted accountability, went before the judge. And this was pre-January. And the prosecutors just said, Judge, I don't think that the guidelines really addressed the full effect of the harm of having stolen 2 cars. And judge agreed, gave him 10 years to serve.
Yeah, I heard about that one. Crazy.
So those are the things that you look at from a community perspective, say, well, really, is this in our best interest? I don't know, but that's the task that we have nowadays as prosecutors. We have that obligation to keep remembering that we serve the entirety of the community, and that also includes the interests of the accused, the victim, and those around us, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to do justice, is by trying to educate the courts as to what is a reasonable sentence and making those recommendations, so that instead of hiding behind, and judge, I defer to you. No, judge, I'll tell you what I think this case is worth, because I've worked it for 6 months. You've had it for 30 minutes. So that we have to be much more aggressive in that regard, and hopefully educate the system as to what we really need to do to obtain justice for the victims.
Yeah. I saw another good question on here. What can people who are not lawyers, sheriff's deputies or police officers or judges, what can they do to help?
Hold us accountable. And that literally means you call out the prosecutors if they're not serving the interests of the community. You call out the judges. You call out the defense attorneys. You call out, the sheriff's office or the chiefs, and you have to let them know that, wait a second, first of all, we want transparency, because we want to know what you're doing and how you're doing it. And then speaking to it on a public forum, be it, letters to the editors, the Facebooks, the social media, those are things that are very helpful. And if you are fortunate enough to be a juror, then you stand your ground and you speak for the voice of the community. You don't go with the herd, which is, oh, we're going to go ahead and kind of run with it. And as it's happened in the past, where prosecutors have a tendency to ask for maximums because their thought is that the jury's not going to give it to them. But then the juries trust prosecutors so much, they're thinking, you must know something more, so I am going to give them a max. And that just, at the end of the day, that is not serving our community's best interests. So hold us accountable.
Brian, what do you think?
I think it depends where you live too. In Richmond last week, there was a car protest outside the Richmond City Jail to try to put pressure there on the political actors. Some of it's going to be writing letters. There's a lot of other organizations throughout the Commonwealth working hard on this. ACLU of Virginia, Legal Aid Justice Center, among many, many, many others. So there probably, wherever you live, there's probably someone working locally on that, and people working on kind of broader DOC issues. Those are the prisons for adults, or DJJ issues. Those are the prisons for children, both of which have advocates working in those facilities or trying to work to get people out of those facilities or have them get the help they need during this time.
Yeah. If you live, we're all fortunate to work in jurisdictions where the prosecutors are at least trying to do the right thing. Thank you, Buda. There are places though in Virginia where that's not happening. So I would, like you were saying, Buda, in those instances, you'd want to their elected officials, hold them accountable, make your voice heard in that regard. I think that apart from outside of that though, if you're in a place where it's more the judge, like the courts, or I guess even if it's the prosecutor, speaking your mind to the public. So letters to the editor, things of that nature. Being involved in civic groups that do grassroots advocacy, even in the courthouse, where you're writing letters to the court, things like that, through the bar association, whatever it takes. And then I think also the same kind of pressure can be applied to the governor. The governor needs to hear from voters. This is the only reason the governor wouldn't do something. I think, of course, there's principle, but politicians are driven by votes, and they're keeping an eye on that. The more people they hear from, the more people the governor Northam hears from, or his, the secretary of the Commonwealth, whoever it is that's going to be looking at this, the more likely it is that he'll take action.
And Brad, the group that you were mentioning, you also have to think about, especially what we saw with the Virginia legislatures this past session, or this current session. A lot of amazing things got passed that literally last year we wouldn't have put a 1 to 20 odds bet on it. We wouldn't have wasted that $1 because there was just no chance that was going to happen. So we also have our local delegates and state senators who we can speak to and say, you've done these things, you consider these things. Now we need you to carry more of our water to be able to say, let's let's get to put pressure on the governor. As well as if there has to be additional legislation, how do we do that? We have to, as a community, be able to let those who are elected understand what our wants and our needs are. You know, when you look at the criminal justice system, but for the sheriff and the prosecutor, the county attorney, there's no one else that's directly accountable to the people. You know, judges are accountable to the legislation, the legislators.
Sometimes.
Well, accountable in the sense that they get appointed and
Sometimes barely.
Well, barely, but it's okay. But at least it's a process.
Yes.
But that's what we have to be able to do is if it impacts you as a community member, use your voice.
And Brad, one last thing on there of a timely, an important thing for everyone to do is if you don't have people in your community working on this, or if you want to work on this, is see what's going on in the courthouse. A lot of people don't want to be in court right now, and there's an increasing number of hearings where no one is present, or hearings are starting to move online, and the public has a right to view those hearings. So even if they're going to do a hearing online, the courtroom is closed, they have to make that available for the public to watch or listen to, or be on the phone, be on the Zoom, whatever it is that they're using. And that's going to be part of our new normal from here over the next few months. And if no one is watching what's happening in courts, no one's watching prosecutors, no one's watching judges, we won't know what's going on in those courtrooms, especially in some of the smaller counties, and we won't be able to change it. So court watching is always important, and it's going to be even more important going forward.
Totally agree with that. And we haven't even talked about the way this is affecting some of our clients' due process rights, or their rights to fair trial or speedy trial. Every time there's a risk to anyone, the first people that are expected to bear the burden of that, it's defendants. And so we see this, for example, so we don't want people in court, so we're going to start having them appear virtually, or from a television set. Well, a lot of people don't know that you have a right to be personally present at your court hearings. Every time you take your lawyer, every time you put somebody in a different spot, to a defendant, can't be close to his lawyer. A lot of times, already it's difficult to understand what a judge is saying, can't hear it, can't process that information, can't consult with a lawyer before or after the hearing. There's all kinds of things that go on that people don't think about. They're just like, oh, well, it's just like our Zoom happy hour. No, it's not. There's a reason that it's mandated that, a person actually be present for their own trial, their own guilty plea. But every time we have something like this, there's just a rush. Let's take that away. Let's do this differently. Let's, have teleconferences for this kind of hearing, or just continue cases and not let people out. When our first inclination should be how can we ensure this person's right to a fair trial, and what accommodations do we have to make in order to preserve that right, while protecting the community. And I think for the most part, what that means is actually letting people out of jails, because we worry a lot less. We worry a lot less about having these, video pleas and stuff. If we can do them in a year, and we can do them in person in a year, we don't even have to cross that bridge. So we should be doing more of that. Any other good questions you guys saw that we should tackle? We're kind of getting on to an hour here. One last thing, actually, this would seem to be like a good final question for y'all. Although there's some things that we seem to be doing, or like jumping off from that last point I was making, there are other interesting things that are happening from a public safety perspective, like fewer people are being arrested, and the crime rate is not going up, and fewer people are being held in jail, and the crime rate's not going up. And yes, we're all under it's a state of emergency, but at the same time, how's that different than any other law? If you're inclined to break, to beat up your wife, like, you're probably not going to be that scared of going outside and walking 4 feet away from someone. So what it's showing to me is that when there's a community effort to trust people and to expect them to take care of each other, people can follow those rules. People can do the right thing. Like, people who you think are bad just because they got arrested by a cop who wrote a police report, you think they're bad, they're dangerous, whatever. The fact of the matter is they're human beings, and what we're finding out now, in my opinion, is at least that they're a lot more like you and I and everybody else, than I think the general public wants to think. And maybe we all ought to open our eyes a little bit more on that point.
Valid.
All right, cool. Last words?
No, just be engaged, be safe, wash your hands, and if you need a daggone yardstick ×2, then use it. But that social distancing, because we don't know how much longer this is going to be, and it is going to get tougher. It's going to get tougher from an emotional perspective, a mental health perspective, a safety perspective. But we just have to be mindful that each of us can control certain things within our own circle, and that's our obligation to make sure we're protecting ourselves, so we're protecting those. So be safe.
Brian, any final thoughts on this point?
No, Parissa asked a great question on Facebook that we do not have time for, but hopefully we can drag her into the next one where we talk about what life is going to look like in the next 60 days to a year instead of what it's looking like right now. And for all of you, those who are saying thank you, we have a second part coming up talking about our legislative update. So don't leave yet. Other interesting conversations still to come.
So we are going to say goodbye to Buda now. Thank you so much. You are the best.
Thank you, guys. And thank you
Really
very much for having us.
Yeah, appreciate your input, and really thank you for the good work you're doing out in Loudon.
Thank you, guys,
Very
and
refreshing.
continue.
It's wonderful change. So
I appreciate you guys. Thank you.
So and now we will be joined by Ashley Shapiro in a moment, and we're going to talk more about. I don't know if Buda's still there. Ashley's coming. So yeah. We haven't done this. Hi, Jack. Everyone, this is Jack Corrali. Jack is currently the executive director for the Fairfax County Democratic Party, but he's also a member of our executive team, Justice Forward Virginia, and for a while he was our managing director and did awesome work this last legislative session. And also joining is Ashley Shapiro. Ashley is another member of the board. Ashley was sort of our go-to lobbyist over this past session. And so now we've got a nice little group here, and I thought we could talk about what went on in the 2020 session of the Virginia General Assembly. For those of you, a lot of this is brand new to y'all. I think a lot of you watching or have been watching have gotten familiar with some of the legislative process because you've come to our lobby days. But just so you're aware, to give you a little bit of a backdrop on how Virginia works and how far we've come. So in Virginia, we have a part-time legislature. So we have 100 delegates, 40 senators. They all ostensibly work, part-time. And they're only in session for 60 days this year. So it was early January to early March. And they had to consider 2,000 bills and figure out which of those they wanted to enact into law. Almost all of these legislators only have one person full-time helping them with policy, one legislative aide. Some of them who are in leadership have a few more, but they end up relying on groups like ours, Justice Forward Virginia, and others to inform them, get them up to speed, help them realize why they ought to care about something. And the reason we started as a group is because for a long time in Virginia, there was no organization that was committed to criminal justice reform as its only business. There are many great organizations that we've partnered with, we've teamed with, that do work on this issue or that, but there are very few, there were none actually, that made it their only business. We thought that was necessary because there are groups on the exact opposite side of these issues that make it their only business and that have a lot of influence in Richmond. So that's why we started, and that's why we've been working so hard, because we have a big role to fill. There's a gap in the advocacy community, and we intend to fill it. And we've been growing with your help in that regard. So where have we gotten this year? There's been a lot. We've been around for 3 years, and we've focused. As of this year, we really got deep into legislative advocacy. So we drafted a lot of legislation. I think we drafted 10 or 11 bills. We also have, over the years, we're on our third lobby day. Lobby day being just a day when volunteer advocates come to Richmond and to come talk about the things, our policy priorities, the things that we want to see passed. And we go down and we talk to all the delegates and senators. And this year we talked to also the Attorney General. The first year, by the way, we had maybe 35 people. The second year, 55. This year we had over 100 sign up, and just a few less than 100 actually were there. And it was amazing. We made contact with every single legislative office. And like I mentioned, we ended up meeting also with Attorney General Herring. So just to give you the sort of the recap of what we were talking about and what we accomplished, our goals for this session were, we put them under a couple of different headings. One was we wanted to end the trial penalty. I'll have Brian explain kind of what that is in a minute. We also wanted to advocate for different discovery rules. And we wanted to make reforms to Virginia's system of pretrial detention and cash bail. So we had some success with that. Brian, I'll move over to you because again, I'm talking too much and I'm feeling like I'm doing that. So can you just fill folks in on what's the trial penalty and how are we looking to address that with our bills this year?
Sure. So the trial penalty, briefly, for everyone who doesn't know, is because basically right now we don't have a system of trials in the United States. We have a system of pleas. Almost 95% of cases nationwide are resolved by plea. And the reason for that is we incentivize people to plead guilty. And the easiest example of that in Virginia is if you give a little bit of cocaine to a friend of yours, that's distribution of cocaine. The punishment range for that is 5 years to 40 years in prison. If you plead to a judge, you can get probation and get 0 years in prison. But if you go to trial and you lose, the jury has to give you 5 years in prison. So basically you're having every incentive for someone, whether you're guilty or not, but if there's any risk of you getting found guilty, you're going to avoid a trial and you're going to plead guilty so that you don't have to go to prison for 5 years, which is an outrageous sentence for anyone who gives almost any amount, especially a small amount of drugs to a friend of theirs. So this year we had several bills we were hoping to get passed relating to that.
I've got the list if you don't.
I have the list up.
Okay, cool.
Or at least the ones we drafted. So one of them was our robbery bill, which those of you who were on for the first hour, Brad mentioned, basically saying robbery, which is punishable by 5 years to life. If you push someone and take their shoes at school, that shouldn't be the same thing as taking a gun to someone's head and saying, give me your wallet. And it was going to make degrees of robbery so that there'd be different versions of that based off of the level of violence you use basically to achieve your goal. That unfortunately did not pass the House, but it did pass the Senate. So that was, quite frankly, a lot farther than I thought that bill would have gone. We had our voir dire bill pass, which I think is a trial penalty issue as well. Jurors in Virginia recommend a sentence if they find someone guilty. And previously, no one was allowed to tell them basically what the sentencing range was. So they weren't allowed to know this robbery is 5 years to life. They convict some kid for pushing someone down and taking their shoes, saying, oh, we'll find him guilty, but we won't give him that much of a sentence. And then they have to give him 5 years. So now, and this one did pass both houses, we will be able to tell jurors in voir dire up front what the sentencing range is, which will be a great first step to having a more fair trial. There were several other bills that did not pass, despite what I think was a lot of great advocacy, including bills that would have let juries suspend a sentence down from that 5 years, among many other bills. Some of them passed the Senate. Most of them died in the House, which is kind of a continuing theme this year, that a lot of good bills died in a House committee, unfortunately, even after they passed the full Senate. So we made a good dent in, certainly a better dent than ever before in the trial penalty in Virginia, but there's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I want to highlight that or hit on that again, because this is, for those of you who aren't following, I mean, it's been, some people would say, including Senator Scott Surville, that we've never had an era of criminal justice reform in Virginia. But this is maybe the first time we've ever really made meaningful reforms to make our system more compassionate and evidence informed and restorative. And so we went into the session with some high hopes. I think when we started our organization, we didn't even ever think we could get a bill passed. And then maybe a year in, we're like, let's get a bill passed. And then as this session was starting, we thought we had 10 or 11. We're like, let's get them all passed. But looking at it back in retrospect, to get 2.5 of the things that we actually drafted passed is pretty freaking awesome. These are issues that are not that, the sexy issues. I'm really using the air quotes too much, but bear with me. There you go. That are not like the things that lay people necessarily understand, but as practicing attorneys, public defenders, are the kind of things that have a huge impact on the lives of people who are involved in the criminal justice system. So being able to make our jury sentencing system more fair, allowing defendants to be able to get experts and the kind of help they need in a 21st century justice system without telling the prosecutor, it's a big freaking deal. And then, as we're finding out now, there was the issue of discovery reform. Those of you who don't know, even as we sit here today, Virginia is one of 9 states where if you're charged with a crime, you can't even see the police report from your own case. So you heard that right. Doesn't matter if you're charged with DUI or murder. If you're going to trial and you're not guilty and you're going to plead not guilty, the government still has no obligation to let you see the police reports from your own case. You don't have any obligation to let you see witness lists, to give you witness statements, none of it. And in Virginia, that's something that we've trying to get changed for a long time. We were going hard for a pretty bold reform of that in the legislature this year. What we got was a bill that basically guarantees that it's going to actually happen, and that the Supreme Court of Virginia, which is the body that currently is, reforming it with a different rule, they're making the change. But we have guaranteed that through getting a discovery bill passed that basically is like, it's a backstop. If the Supreme Court tables their rule, then our bill goes into effect. So I think it's useful, though, for people who are watching this. If they have questions about specific bills, great, and they can bring those up. But for us to just talk about the political dynamics, do any of you feel comfortable kind of wading in those waters, or do you want me to kind of get it started? Speak up if you do. Okay, so I'll at least say the first part. We're organized as a nonprofit advocacy group, and we do that for a reason. Because although it is true, I think that Democrats are more likely to support criminal justice reform, by no means do they support it as a rule. And I would say Virginia's Democratic Party, probably less than half, are truly allies in the movement. A lot of them say they are, but when you get down to brass tacks, is it really something they care about? Or are they worried about public safety votes, pressure from the local police department, or families, families who are worried about safety in their community, or prosecutors, because the prosecutors have a really strong lobby. So we're organized as a nonprofit advocacy group for a reason. It used to be that Republicans entrusted criminal justice reform to a couple of their most ardently tough on crime legislators. And there was one committee called the House of Delegates Courts of Justice Committee, and specifically the criminal subcommittee, that those 2 delegates were in charge of, and they would just kill everything. Well, what happened when the Democrats took over? There are a lot of really great, allies of ours that were so helpful. I mean, I could give shout outs to a lot of them, like Scott Servo and Patrick Cope and Joe Morrissey and Jeff Bourne, Don Scott, Jen Carol Foy. How could I forget her? Tons that were so helpful. And Senator John Edwards, so many that Cree Deeds, people who were fighting hard for what we wanted. But then you have key people in leadership who just don't buy it, who just don't support what we do. And unfortunately, a lot of them were in the House of Delegates this year. They're all nice folks, nothing bad to say about them personally, but on these issues and on a political level, it's just a fact. They don't want what we want. And what you find is when you get bills in front of them, what they're going to do is they're going to take the same side that the prior administration or the prior House did. And they killed a lot of stuff, a lot of great stuff that we had, a lot of great stuff that other advocates came forward with. I think a good one probably for us to talk about, at least to touch on a little bit, and sort of its evolution through the legislative process, was marijuana legalization and decriminalization, because that was something where a lot of people believe they had the votes for it. They had the votes to fully legalize marijuana. You don't need a regulatory body. You don't need or a system set up. You can just legalize it without actually having it be bought and sold. That is possible. You can legalize the personal possession of it. They didn't want to do it. We probably had the votes, but because there was leadership that didn't support it. I think a lot of people would point to that as that really was what stood in the way. That was the obstacle to getting these more bold reforms done, like actually bold, not just bold in the press releases that you see, in the recap from a month after. What do you guys think? Thoughts on that?
So I think you make a really interesting point bringing up marijuana, because that, I think, really is sort of the bill that everybody wanted to touch on, right? I mean, I can't remember how many different versions of a marijuana decriminalization, marijuana legalization bill that there was in the General Assembly this year, both in the House and the Senate. But the final bill that we got, HB 972, sort of tried to do all things at once, right? Like it tried to say that, yes, we're doing decriminalization on one hand, and it was a $25 civil penalty, but it also included language about legalization, saying that, well, we're going to study legalization and look at the economic impact and look at all the different metrics that we should be looking at in terms of legalization to have a full picture, right? With a deadline for that being November of 2021. Now, what also happens in November 2021 is we elect the governor, and lieutenant governor and attorney general, and the House of Delegates. And it's interesting. I was looking at some of what the governor had put out in response to signing these pieces of legislation, and the stuff will, in the veto session will be discussed more on April 22nd, is the moving that date to the end of November till after the election. So it's 972, HB 972, tried to do all things, but I mean, if you look back on LIS, which is the Legislative Information Service for the General Assembly, there were, I would count maybe 24 different marijuana bills, some by the same people with almost the exact same language, except for maybe a comma was placed somewhere else, right? And everybody wanted to be the person that did that. And what ultimately got passed through, I mean, we can sort of discuss that a little bit, is sort of halfway to where legalization should be, right?
Yeah, and before we get too far, I want to make sure I'm clear about this. So a senator who represents part of Arlington, much of Alexandria, Senator Adam Evan, has been championing legalization and decriminalization for a really long time. He fought really hard for this. I know he would have liked it to have gone further. He was the patron of the bill that passed through the Senate. Nothing bad to say about Adam at all. He did a great job, and understand. I think there's a difference of opinion among some advocates just that recognizes the political reality of dealing with another chamber, the House, that isn't necessarily as bold on these issues as the Senate is. But I just wanted to give a shout out to Senator Evan because he's great. So didn't want to sidetrack there, though, even though I did. My bad. Maybe I use some more air quotes.
This is the air quotes live stream, right?
That's right, air quotes. Can you put air quotes around air quotes? Who knows? There are no rules here.
I think when you're talking about the political reality, what was fairly shocking was that it really was an infight in the party, and really an infight between the two chambers, that you had Democrats fighting with each other on these issues. You had Democrats who fully wanted, I think it was Delegate Carol Foy's just took marijuana out of the schedule. It was a simple change, and then that was it. And it would have just decriminalized it completely. And instead of that, we had advocates from various organizations trying to explain that decriminalization still allows for racially based profiling, racially based policing. It doesn't get rid of any of that. And you had some Democrats on board with that, others that didn't want to take that plunge per se and do anything about that problem. And so the political reality is it is a lot of infighting. And I think going into the session, there was a lot of excitement about the change in party control, and it's been very much tempered by who's actually in power. And as Brad said, with regard to the House Courts Committee, there really is a lot of not being on the same page with the leadership as some of the other members in stymieing criminal justice reform.
Now, I will also say, to go off Buta's point earlier, Democrats being in control has overall been a good thing. If you look at the across the board, right, across all the different types of legislation that was passed, you could say this was the most progressive General Assembly in Virginia's history, right? And it certainly was. But it differed on different issues, and I think that is, to your point, Brad, that it just depends on who the person is who's in charge of the committee. Because you can have as many members of the committee as you want who are with you, but if the chair of that committee wants to hold something back or has an amendment to something that they want to see go through, they sort of get a little bit more power to do so. And so on some of these issues, especially, I guess, outside of marijuana, like looking at other criminal justice issues, we saw that really sort of take root.
Yeah, even on this, we don't want to sound like ingrates. I mean, there's so much of this stuff we've been asking for years, and to get any of it's great. It's just that we look at it as more, we had a massive opportunity, like an opportunity for transformative change, right? And what we got was, an incremental step in the right direction. But I think another one besides for marijuana was it was disappointing to a lot of people. There was a push for parole to be reinstated and for something to be done about expungements. A lot of people don't realize. A lot of people don't realize a lot of things related to our criminal justice system. But in Virginia, I hear this all the time. I'm sure you guys do too, from clients and former clients. They say, "Yeah, can you help me get that my assault charge from 15 years ago expunged?" And I have to, regretfully answer, "No, I can't. There's no way to do that. That's on your record forever." And it's just a fact in Virginia, no matter how old your conviction is, no matter what kind of conviction it is, it's a misdemeanor or
Juvenile
felony.
convictions.
Yeah, it's on your record forever. So there's been an effort to even just here and there, pick a certain charge. If it was somebody who had a whatever, some of these deferred dispositions, either like diversion programs where you can't get stuff expunged. Well, let's start there. Let's start by letting somebody who had a pot charge, let them get their arrest expunged. And even those little bits, people have a problem with it. And why should we have a problem with that? Why should we have a problem with expunging old pot arrests, especially for decriminalizing? And you can bring all the people you want for people who used to be involved in the justice system, returning citizens, people for whom this is creating a massive obstacle towards progress, towards moving forward in their lives and getting jobs or, voting, a lot of them. They want to have a clean record. They want to show they paid their debt to society, and our laws aren't letting them do that. You would think that's a progressive idea, like progressives are supposed to be defined by empathy, defined by the belief that people deserve second chances, and we can't even give them second chances in the most obvious of situations like that.
And interesting in another way, Brad, in Virginia, expungement reform has been a bipartisan issue for several years, where members of both parties have put in bills to do varying levels of that, and they always died in the House mostly. And this year, the same thing. In other states, it's also been a bipartisan issue as well, as are a lot of criminal reform issues. They end up being bipartisan. And we saw some of that this session with some of the people we were able to work with, both in terms of electeds and in terms of other advocacy groups. So it's particularly disappointing that the House sent all of their expungement bills basically for a study when it wasn't really a partisan issue, at least on the main, or they could have gotten a lot done the kind of middle ground they did on marijuana for expungements and would have gotten votes from both sides, but instead they did nothing.
And the other thing I brought up was parole. We were sort of on a little bit on the outside of that issue. We took an interest, and it was in a lot of our advocacy materials, but we weren't really lobbying that hard, just because there was already such an amazing advocacy community that had been built some of the most committed advocates you've ever seen down in Richmond, and the people who are in those committee rooms for those hearings can tell you that, showing up all the same t-shirts, basically asking the people and asking those in power for second chances for their loved ones, or just the people, their loved ones, the acquaintances of their loved ones, whoever. That is it's a total common sense reform. Yeah, it's a big change. But to give you some context, back in, when was it? Was it 91, 92? When was it, Brian and Ashley?
Parole 94.
94, okay. So there used to be a system of parole in Virginia, and what that means is that the judge imposes a sentence, and maybe it's 20 years, and then says that after 10 years, you'll have an opportunity to get parole. And then a parole board decides whether you're reformed, whether you've done good enough things, whether you've gained some insight into your conduct, whether you're showing the ability to integrate back into society and be productive. It makes a lot of sense to have parole, because that's the goal of our correctional system, as they say. They don't call it a correctional system for nothing. The goal is to correct. So if the goal is to correct, what you want to do is have an opportunity to find out whether that goal has been accomplished. Now, in practice, our system doesn't do that. That's another story. But for the people that it does do that, they should have an opportunity to get out, and they should have an opportunity to prove it. Well, we took that away from them during a time in Virginia history and American history when everybody was all geared up about rising crime rates and being tough on crime and all of that. So we got rid of parole because there was this thought that people were getting out too early. We replaced it with a system, they call it truth in sentencing. So if people serve at least 87, 88% of their sentences, if you give them 20 years, they're serving almost all of it. But what that's done, it's again taken away that opportunity, that belief in principle in restoration and rehabilitation. It's also led to much longer prison sentences. And if we're not going to do it on the front end, because apparently we aren't, when people are, even reformers, delegates and senators, they're so opposed. They always say, oh yes, I'm totally in favor of ending mass incarceration for people who are serving nonviolent sentences and drug charges. And you're like, well, I mean, you're not going to solve the problem unless, like we were talking about earlier, unless you start worrying about the folks who are serving sentences for violent crimes. And if you're not going to do it on the front end, if you're not going to do it on the front end by addressing mandatory minimums or trial penalty issues, then you got to do it on the back end. You got to give people an opportunity to show that they've changed. So we had all this. There was all this teed up for the legislature to make a decision on this, to actually make some progress. There are tons of support for these issues, and I think there were the hearings we watched. They were both advocating for reinstating parole, even just little bits like parole for younger offenders. And there were 2-hour hearings, people telling their stories to their families and their loved ones, and they just punted. Like there was a very small change they made to it's called fishback. Basically, there's a very small number of people serving sentences in the Department of Corrections who were sentenced at a time that juries couldn't know that parole had been abolished. So I got that right? So anyway, it's like the most minor possible change that doesn't really affect anything once those people's issues are fixed. So why aren't we looking at that? And I don't seriously, when they say, by the way, that they're setting something for a study, and they do this all the time. They have a bill that's before them. It's been, they know all about it. Everybody knows all about it. And they say, we're going to send it to the Crime Commission for a study. What they really mean most of the time is they're killing the bill. So they're never going to do anything about it. They just don't want to have a vote with their name on it saying that they're voting nay to something that they actually honestly oppose. So they did that with the parole stuff. I don't know how we get to a point. How do we? This is a good question because again, I've been hogging the time. But how do we get to a point that they start caring about this stuff, guys and gals?
Well, that's the $1 billion question, right?
It is.
How do we get legislators to care about something? And I think something that we saw that was really effective, and like you said earlier, Brad, that we had over 100 people sign up for our lobby day, is that once legislators knew that, right? When we were organizing this thing, once legislators started to know, okay, they got 100 people and they got 2 of our constituents coming down, or they got 3 of our constituents coming down, then they start to listen, because these are people who are, it's part-time legislature. right? These are people who might not have an expertise in the field of criminal justice. They might be lawyers, but just not deal with the criminal legal system. That having their constituents come through, writing letters to the editor, like Buda was talking about, writing to their legislator, writing to their local elected officials, I think we've seen is a major way to shape public discourse and the discourse around the public policy. And we even see that on the national level. I mean, we have running for the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party for president is Joe Biden, one of the key contributors to the '94 crime bill, but has listened to the community, has sat down with the people most affected by that, and now has one of the most progressive, I mean, we can talk till the cows come home about the 2020 presidential field, but between his presumptive nomination and the incumbent president, has one of the most progressive criminal justice platforms. So clearly, talking to your legislators, having these conversations, not just with the legislators, but with your neighbors and building public awareness, does something to improve the result of public policy.
And to be slightly more cynical about it, he knows that in order to win, he's got to boost turnout. And there's a certain segment of the world that cares about this more than other people do. And if we get people to care about it too, that's, I think, another big thing. And that's a hurdle we always encounter. People care about our issues. People care about criminal justice reform, but do they know what it looks like? So and they don't. A lot of them don't. So people come out with these press releases, like last week, we passed this bold slate of criminal justice reform laws. No, you didn't. But no one knows the difference except for us. We're the only ones that look at it like, this is nothing. Like, you got to do more than that. So I guess the more information people have, the more they are listening to the right voices. The more they understand the changes that really need to be made. It's hard to get folks to understand some of this really wonky stuff, but we're in it for the long haul, aren't we?
I was pretty heartened by some conversations I had with legislators who were not familiar with criminal justice issues, and I think that there's still a common trope about tough on crime and not wanting a headline where they contributed to some bill and then something terrible happens. And so I think there's still some fear of that dating back from the 90s. But when you actually sit down and talk to people that aren't entrenched in this is common sense stuff that we're talking about. And I actually thought that it was very easy to talk to people on both sides of the aisle who would listen to us, listen to our experiences, and really rethink the way that they had viewed an issue like parole. People view parole now as a way of murderers just running free on the streets. But when you have all these people testifying, you have all these experiences being shared, I felt like a lot of legislatures, perhaps not the right ones, but a lot of people that we talked to were actually very interested in that. And I think it's just a matter of time as advocates become more specialized in what they're talking about, and we have certain issues that we're talking about. I think people will start to listen, because right now is the backswing from the 90s. Criminal justice reform, people care about now. People want to know about these issues. People want to help and want to know how to help. And I think it's just us getting our name out there, having advocates come with us, and really developing those relationships that maybe it wasn't as successful this year, but in the coming years, when the people who are more reticent to agree with us start hearing from their constituents and start hearing from the media and start hearing from groups that that's what they want, then they'll be more open to letting those kind of reforms through.
It's a winning message politically too, right? Like we're talking about, Virginia is a completely different place than where it was last year, right? Last year at this time, we had a much different legislature. We had much different people in positions of power all across the board, right? And you saw, now, we did the math just to figure it out, but just last year with the elections from last year, a fifth of Virginians are represented by their local prosecutor, who is a progressive prosecutor, right? And like that can, that's taking looking at places like Buda up in Loudoun County and Parisa down in Arlington, Steve Descano over in Fairfax, look down in Charlottesville. All across the board, people voted for these reform-minded candidates. And I think that went down to the state legislature as well. I don't think I saw more criminal justice reform sub pages on people's issues page on their website than there was last year. So it's clearly a winning message, and that includes Republicans too, who see it as this I don't want to say nonpartisan issue, but this bipartisan issue that you have your old guard of both parties that is against reform or has a much different view of reform. But now the newer guard, the people taking on new leadership roles within the parties, are embracing criminal justice reform. I mean, we had people from all stripes join our lobby day this year, and I foresee that happening in every lobby day since from now on, just because it is a bipartisan issue that most people can agree on. I mean, I think the ACLU did a poll in 2017. It was something like 60% of Virginians support criminal justice reform in some way, shape, or form. And that was 2017. So imagine how much we've moved the ball since the 90s, how much more we can move the ball now.
Ashley, maybe for people who were here that were at our lobby day, when you were the one doing the heavy lifting day to day down in Richmond during the session, how do you think it helped or affected what you were doing? The fact that we had 100 people at lobby day, the fact that we had people who could email, how do you think that changed this year compared to prior years?
I think they took us seriously. When they saw me or one of us there, they knew that we were listening. They knew that we would report back to all of those people that we had connections with. And I think they listened when we testified. We had people from Justice Forward. We had people that were public defenders and other attorneys coming to testify. And I think more so than any other year, as we develop our reputation, that comes from lobby day. It comes from having that big presence. It comes from them knowing it's not just, the five of us. It's statewide. We have people statewide in all of their jurisdictions that are watching them. And I think because of that, they took us seriously more so than before. Now, a lot was kicked for study, but I think that goes back to Brad said, they don't want to have the no on there. If they didn't care about the issue, they would have just voted no. So while I certainly think it was punting on a lot of these issues, I think in other years they would have just voted no. So at least it shows that they don't want to be against these issues publicly. And I think that's a lot because of the public pressure that we've been able to put on.
It does. I did notice this year also some people taking some surprising positions. We give flack to some of the leadership in the House, but and Delegate Mullen, if you watch this at any point, hi. We had actually really nice dialogue with him on a number of different points, but he's, I don't think he's naturally inclined to be totally on our side on this stuff. But this year he was getting all behind juvenile justice reform, like getting disorderly conduct out of schools. I think he may have supported raising the transfer age? I forget. But there are a number of other really important, significant juvenile justice reforms. And then he also helped us get our ex parte funding and our voir dire bills through. So and we, by the way, I think a lot of people don't know this, but we were working really early on this stuff. So last year, probably it might have been May when we had a meeting about what our legislative priorities were, and then we wrote bills. And then by the summer, we were talking to legislators, like Delegate Mullen and others, and have meetings with them, like people who may not have been naturally just sort of inclined to agree with us, and explain to them that you don't need to go, you don't need to end prisons in order to make progress. We don't, however you feel about ending prisons. What you can do is you can just make sensible changes that allow disadvantaged people to have a fair shot in court, or to have a life in the future, even if they've done something, had one bad day, when they were young. Are there any if there were, I haven't been monitoring the questions. Are there any questions that we've gotten we should answer? Well, what about next year? One of you guys, other than me, we talked a little bit about jury sentencing, but we had an opportunity to make that really big change this year. Ashley, Brian, or Jack, when you want to talk about that, because that's going to be definitely on the front burner next year.
I think I would say the bill that I'm most excited about that came out this year was the bill allowing us to tell the juries about about the sentence. That's huge and impacts every single jury that we're going to set from July 1st onward. And that's a huge deal. And building on that was a bill that would have allowed a judge trial, or a jury trial, but a judge sentencing. So when we're talking about the hesitancy we've seen with mandatory minimum reform, the hesitancy we've seen with even just jury minimums, it would get rid of a lot of that, because we would be able to have a judge sentence on, but a jury decide guilt. And that bill would completely change the way that we practice, and would completely change the calculus for whether or not we risk a trial. And that's going to vary based on what types of judges you have. But the beauty of that type of bill is it's not universal, that you have the flexibility and the discretion to decide which type of sentencing you want. If you're in a more conservative jurisdiction where you maybe don't want your jury sentencing, then you don't have to. If you're in a place like Richmond, if I have a simple possession, I'm probably going to want the jury to sentence, because they're not going to put my person on probation. They're probably going to give a fine, but you have that kind of discretion. Whereas right now we don't. It's all the way jury or all the way judge. And we're only one of 6 states that even allow jury sentencing, but we're the only one that doesn't tell them about the sentence in advance and doesn't have that any kind of authority. And then building on that to allow the jury to suspend a sentence. We got a little aggressive in our bill, trying to let them do everything a judge can do, but even a simple bill that allows them just to recommend a suspended sentence. If it's 5 years on a distribution and they want to give probation, and that's what the community says is the proper sentence, then that should be what the community should be allowed to do. And both of those bills died this year, but would be, I think, for my priorities, really big priorities next year.
Yeah, even Texas, right? Texas has jury sentencing, but they give you a choice. I mean, if they can do it, can't we? I mean,
I think Colorado too.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Alabama might be in that list as well.
Somebody made this point. I just want to note this. I was speaking in shorthand when I talked about the juvenile transfer age. Yes, the bill that was passed merely raises the age of for mandatory transfer for violent crimes. So it's called certification in Virginia. So it used to be that if you committed robbery or malicious wounding, aggravated malicious wounding, or whatever, a bunch of other crimes, that all the prosecutor had to do was file a piece of paper and then have a preliminary hearing to get probable cause, and suddenly you're in adult court being tried as an adult. So now, and that was the age was at 14 where they could do that. Now the age is up to 16 for that class of offenses. And then if you're under 16, then there has to be what's called a transfer hearing. So it's like an amenability hearing, they refer to it as, to determine whether the child is amenable to rehabilitation in the juvenile justice system. So just wanted to clarify that since someone brought that up.
Just to shorthand that, what it means is you can still be tried as an adult at 14.
Yes.
That as the rest of the country is moving to raise that age across the board, Virginia did not. They did make it a little harder to treat a child as an adult, and they put some procedural stops to actually look at the child and their background and their history before treating them as an adult. But I want to make it very clear they did not go as far as saying that you cannot be tried as an adult until 16. It is still 14 in Virginia.
Right.
And 2 brief follow-ups on what some people were talking about in the comments here. Kabir has talked about the Good Time bill. Delegate Don Scott had a fantastic bill that would have allowed for people to get out of the Department of Corrections sooner if they were doing everything they needed to do in terms of taking programs and not having issues in the Department of Corrections. It was actually supported by DOC, is my recollection from watching those hearings. And it would have, I think it was something like 2,000 people it would have let out of DOC. It was something crazy. So that's a great bill that I think is going to come back up next year after they think about it a little bit more. Anne was talking about some of the changes to our bail system. There were some minor changes passed this year. I know there's going to be more next year, again, trying to get more people out of jail pre-trial. So that's going to be another thing that'll be a focus of the next session.
We were disappointed this year because we had mandatory minimums on our list of top legislative priorities. We got a ton of support from Delegate Hope and Senator Edwards. Don't want to demote him or reassign him, sorry. But you know, all they were asking for, at least Patrick Cope was a study. You know, just let's figure out what's going on here. That's all he was asking for. And the bill got killed. You know, it was a study to see, like, is this sensible criminal justice policy? Are people getting actually convicted of these mandatory minimum charges they're being charged with, or are they being convicted of other like fiction, like legal fictions? Gosh, I keep doing that. There's my air quotes again. Or they're convicted of something else because, like, prosecutors, like, no, there's no way I'm going to, you know, convict you of a mandatory life offense. I'm going to offer you something less, and let's pretend that it's this or that. But you know, it gives you insight into that, gives you insight into the length of sentences that people are serving, whether it makes the community safer. Those are the kind of things we need to know to make sensible policy. Recidivism rates, you know, that's another thing. And they wouldn't even approve the study. Now, maybe the Crime Commission can still do the study. I don't know. You know, maybe we can help facilitate a study. But it's disappointing. It was disappointing that happened. And I mean, I don't know whether they have an appetite for that issue next year. I really hope they do, because we want to make it a priority again.
I mean, unless anything major happens in terms of composition of the General Assembly, it could certainly be something that comes up again. It's just it's you know, kind of the irony, or sort of maybe not irony, but how funny it is that so many of the things got put to a study, except for the study bill on mandatory minimums, right?
Yes, right.
But right. You know, at the very least, and you could take a look at sort of the transformation of, you know, Senator Eben has been putting in SB2, his bill, the marijuana decrim bill, for years since joining the Senate. I think even since when he was in the House, and it's finally passed, right? So for things that really move the ball forward, on things like mandatory minimums or on expungement, we're finally at least having the conversations now down in Richmond. So it very well could be that it might not have been this session, but a few sessions down the road, hopefully next session, we can get at the very least some studies passed, that, you know, we can continue to move the ball forward on major reforms, right?
Yeah. And every day, I think, as practicing attorneys, something will happen, and you'll notice something new from your practice that really needs to be changed. And actually, Peter Greenspan asked a question about guidelines and the Criminal Sentencing Commission. It's different than the Crime Commission. They need a new name for it because it's way too similar. But they are the people that come up with the guidelines, basically the suggestion of what kind of sentences they should receive. And his issue is in certain kinds of child sexual abuse cases. But one thing I've noticed recently, and a lot of people are aware of this, is that so the whole point of guidelines is to make sentences more similar to each other, like more uniform, so that throughout the state people are getting something similar. Because there's an idea, right, that fairness means treating equally situated people equally. So if you did something similar to someone else, it doesn't matter who your judge is or who your jury is, you should get a relatively similar sentence. Our guidelines purport to do that, but all that they cover is something that's called active time. So the first sentence you get, like at the front end, right after you're convicted. But in our criminal justice system in Virginia, there's another thing called backup time, or back end time, or suspended time. So you'll get a guideline, and the guidelines don't cover that at all. And so you could get somebody where the guidelines say a year, then the judge is like, I'm going to sentence you to a year, which is within the guidelines, but I'm going to give you 10 years of suspended time. And then it could be that the first time you come back to court, the judge gives you all 10 years of that backup time. And another judge may feel completely differently, may, within the guidelines, give you a year at the front end, and then only give you 6 months of suspended time. And then at your violation, only give you 30 days of that, and then take you off probation. So there's this huge variance. And there's also a movement in some of the sort of the scholarship on this to shorten probation sentences anyway, because that's another source of mass incarceration. So I think we're gonna try to do some work on these issues, get some bills in, either to limit the length of a suspended sentence, or limit the length of probation revocation time that's imposed at any hearing. Somebody asked if we can record this. We are recording this. That is something I'm sure a lot of you would have to watch again, but we'll we'll be, blogging and kind of getting more information about stuff like this. I know it is kind of in the weeds, but stay tuned because it's super important. What else? Other issues that we've got coming up that we will be working on next year?
Brad, I think one thing I'll say, since we have a lot of people who do this work either as advocates or lawyers listening right now, if people have ideas on changes that we can make, obviously you can contact your own legislators, but we've started to get some institutional knowledge on this, which has been really helpful. And we'd like to work together with you all to make these changes, whether they're big or small. So definitely let us know, and we'd be happy to help work together on getting those issues out.
Getting all the way there with some of the stuff that we brought up, sort of the halfway there bills that were passed, getting all the way there is also important. So staying on our legislators, policymakers, like you said, that this was just a step towards full legalization. Or with discovery, we talked about discovery, you don't get police reports. Well, our new bill actually, it isn't quite explicit about whether you actually get your own copies of police reports or whether you just get to look at them. I could talk about that for probably months, actually, because I did, as a practicing attorney, litigated that issue a lot. We don't want to get in the world where we're doing that all the time. We want to have attorneys and defendants, people involved in the justice system, actually get the materials they need to prepare for court, not just be able to look at them in a prosecutor's office. So that's another thing. We're going to be fighting for copies of police reports next year. Going to be definitely high on the list. Brian was talking about pretrial reform. Super important. It's wild because it has been such a hot topic. And then for 2 sessions, we've had bills which were intended to be sort of, paving the way for bigger changes, and we didn't even get that. So I don't know where that's going to go, but that is a huge area. Definitely affects mass incarceration, but also the collateral consequences of being involved in the justice system are really much worse if you're detained pretrial. So something we want to stay on. Scott Servell is going to be mad if we don't bring up his crime commission's bill. So the crime commission needs a new name and it needs a new purpose. Right now, there are no people like us. There are a lot of police officers and prosecutors, God bless them, but they don't have our perspective. And that needs to be that perspective on that body that's doing all these studies and making all these recommendations. Senator Servell and Delegate Hope had a great bill to rename the Crime Commission, to repurpose it, to change the membership, to make it more oriented towards reform, rehabilitation, things like that. And it was just unceremoniously killed. I think that one was actually just straight up killed. And actually, he also had a bill to give prosecutors, make clear that prosecutors should have discretion to be lenient. That one also got killed. I think that one needed a little more lobbying. So if you've been following the news in areas like Arlington, where there are reform-oriented prosecutors, sometimes they aren't being allowed to do what they want to do and what the community elected them to do, because judges are standing in the way and they're saying, nope, I'm not letting you do this plea agreement, or reduce this charge to this or that. And Senator Servell's bill would have made clear that prosecutors are in the driver's seat when it comes to charging decisions and plea bargaining and all things like that. Another really good bill. It takes a little while probably to understand, but super significant, especially if you're one of those people who lives in a jurisdiction like Loudoun or Fairfax or Arlington. You thought your vote was going to really change your local justice system. I mean, maybe it's not quite to the level that you would like.
So I think the question on everybody's mind right now is for everybody. How do you get involved? How do you change these laws?
How do other people get involved?
How does a regular person get involved in criminal justice reform in Virginia?
Well, they have to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. We don't have
Shameless plug.
we don't have an Instagram, but you know, we can work on that. Come to our lobby days. We get on our mailing list. We send information on our mailing list. We have events like these. This is where you get the information. I mean, the most important thing, in my opinion, as we've said a number of times, really is getting informed, because you aren't going to know whether this stuff is actually happening unless you're informed about it, unless you know what needs to change and if the bills will change it. So stay plugged in with us, and then I think another one is, once you have that information, and we exist for this purpose, to help you connect with your legislators, connect with your other elected officials. We want to help train you to do that, get you the information you need, but also take some of the mystique out of it and help you be less intimidated, because it's really not intimidating. Meeting with most of our delegates and senators are just like you and I. Well, they're not actually. They're way too old and white, but they, and we are also, for the record, that's something we need to work on as an organization, as diversity. But in terms of who where they live in your community, most of them have jobs, almost all of them have jobs. Go have a coffee with them. Hit them up in the off season. Now is a really now's not a good time, because you can't. Now
Well,
would be
they're
a
all
great
available
time.
for a Zoom call, right?
Yeah, is that actually happening, Jack? Do you know? Are legislators meeting with people virtually?
Yeah, I've been noticing more and more legislators. I mean, at all levels, meeting with people. It might be more of like an office hours type thing. There's Zoom information on their website, and you just join the meeting. But I've been seeing more and more legislators and people, because this is usually the time, especially for the local governments, and it's budget season too for them, where they're doing a lot of town halls and neighborhood discussions. This is Zoom, and not that we're sponsored by Zoom or anything, but things like Zoom have allowed more access to elected officials, just across the board, and they're doing more events. So I would just check with your local party committee for information about what those elected officials that represent that party might be doing in the area.
We could use a sponsorship from Zoom, by the way. If we can get that hooked up, Zoom or really anyone else, money helps. Actually, and there's another answer to the question. You can help make reform happen by contributing to groups like ours. I'm not saying this in a corny way. I hate asking for money. I think Ashley and Brian would agree with me on this. Jack maybe not, because he does this professionally, but we hate it. We're public defenders for a reason. We think that this stuff ought to be done without us getting money for it. We're doing it because it's the right thing to do. But really, to make a difference, you actually need money, and we're finding that out more and more. The greatest thing about having, well, Jack's great for a lot of reasons, but having him full time really freed us up to concentrate on the stuff that we're good at. To have someone like a managing director who deals with the daily ins and outs, the administrative stuff, legislative interactions, setting up meetings, whatever we're doing, that takes a huge burden off, because otherwise it's one of us doing it after we get home from an 8-hour day in court. So if you or anyone are able to make a contribution, I know now is a tough time. It's weird, it feels weird asking for money under circumstances like this, but our work is going on, so we need that for sure. Well, we ended up being you guys have anything else? Final words? No? So I guess it ended up being more like an hour for each segment instead of 45 minutes, but that's good. That's great. I think this is a really great conversation. And for all of you who are watching, I think this went really well, and a few of you are asking us to do it again. And that was our intent. So probably next time we'll bring in some different special guests. We've talked about putting more of a focus on Richmond, since there's a lot of crazy stuff going on there in the courts right now. I think Arlington is also, not to be too Arlington centric, but there's some interesting stuff both the interplay between the prosecutors and the courts, and also just some of the interesting advocacy that's going on. But others of you, stay in touch with us, then we know what's going on in your jurisdictions. Maybe we can also shine a light on what's going on there. And of course, like Brian was saying earlier, to get back to the legislative stuff, we need your ideas. If you have questions about any of this stuff, you want more information, we always are glad to answer questions, talk on the phone, but also your ideas. So a lot of you watching right now are attorneys, and you know what needs to change. A lot of you have had great questions, great, really informed expert type questions. If you have ideas about legislation, how to make our system better, we're looking for those ideas too. So with that, I guess we will go ahead and sign out. Thank you everyone for dropping in, and we will see you soon.
Stay safe, everybody.
Yeah, for sure.